What if I told you that in 19th century Britain, the rich and royal didn't just unwrap Egyptian mummies for fun, they actually ate them? Yes, you heard that right. Powdered pharaohs were sprinkled into wine, rubbed onto wounds, and even served at elegant dinner parties. The guests? Britain's social elite, aristocrats, scholars, and rumor has it, even Queen Victoria herself. Imagine sitting in a candlelit London ballroom, the air thick with cigar smoke and perfume, while a 3,000-year-old mummy is unwrapped before your eyes. Laughter, applause, and morbid curiosity filled the room, as if the desecration of the dead was just another form of entertainment. Welcome to the bizarre world of Victorian mummy mania, a time when science, superstition, and sheer vanity collided in the strangest ways imaginable. In this video, we'll uncover how Britain's fascination with ancient Egypt spiraled into a full-blown obsession, leading to mummy unwrapping parties, medicinal cannibalism, and a trade in human remains that stretched across continents. So, grab your tea and then maybe skip the biscuits, because this story gets dark. Picture the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the height of the British Empire. London was a booming center of wealth, science, and exploration. The Victorians were obsessed with discovery, new lands, new species, and above all, new ways to show off their sophistication. Then came Egypt. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought not only soldiers but scientists and artists, and they brought back something that would change Europe forever: Egyptomania. Suddenly, ancient Egypt wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was the ultimate symbol of mystery and power. Soon after, Britain jumped on the bandwagon. Egypt's treasures began flooding into Europe: hieroglyph-covered statues, golden trinkets, and, most scandalously, mummies. At first, these ancient corpses were treated with reverence, but that didn't last long. By the early 1800s, Britain's wealthy elite were buying mummies by the shipload. Some saw them as collectibles, others saw them as medicine, and for the truly eccentric, they became the centerpieces of macabre dinner parties. You see, for Victorians, death was entertainment, public hangings drew crowds, seances were fashionable, and spiritualism was spreading like wildfire. So when someone realized they could unwrap a real Egyptian mummy in front of guests, with music, champagne, and fine conversation, it became the next great social event. Imagine the scene: a stately London home, chandeliers glowing. The guests in their finest attire. On a long oak table lies a linen-wrapped body, thousands of years old. The host, usually a wealthy explorer or amateur scientist, begins cutting away the bandages. The air fills with the scent of bitumen, myrrh, and decay. Gasps, laughter, curiosity. Guests lean in closer. Some ladies fainted. Others bragged about attending such events as if they were the it parties of the season. And this wasn't just random morbid curiosity, this was status. Owning or unwrapping a mummy showed you had wealth, connections, and culture. Egypt was the exotic jewel of empire, and the British elite couldn't resist turning its dead into dinner entertainment. But here's where it gets even darker. These weren't just nameless, faceless relics. Many were real people, once kings, priests, and mothers. Their bodies had been carefully preserved for eternity, only to be unwrapped and desecrated thousands of years later for clout. Newspapers even advertised these events, calling them scientific demonstrations. But make no mistake, they were closer to Victorian horror shows than archaeology, and the woman at the top of it all, Queen Victoria, wasn't exactly innocent of curiosity. While there's no evidence she devoured mummies herself, her reign fueled Britain's appetite for Egypt's dead. Museums competed to display the most impressive remains, and collectors scrambled to import more. It was a frenzy, a mix of curiosity, power, and moral blindness. But how did this fascination turn from spectacle to something far more sinister: eating the dead? Imagine stepping into a grand London townhouse in the mid-1800s. Outside, horse-drawn carriages clatter down foggy cobblestone streets. Inside, the ballroom glows with candlelight. Servants pour champagne, laughter echoes, and the city's elite, doctors, duchesses, and dabblers in science, gather around a long mahogany table. At the center lies tonight's guest of honor, a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy. This was the height of Victorian mummy mania, When unwrapping ancient corpses wasn't just morbid curiosity, it was considered high culture. Guests arrived dressed to impress, ready to witness history come alive. Or, more accurately, come apart. The host of such events was often a self-styled Egyptologist or a well-traveled gentleman. One of the most famous was Thomas "Mummy" Pettigrew, a surgeon turned showman who made an entire career out of performing public mummy unrollings. He hosted events that mixed science, theater, and a disturbing kind of spectacle. Pettigrew would begin solemnly, with talk of Egyptian rituals, preservation methods, and the mystery of the ancients. But soon the scene would shift. The linen strips were snipped away. The crowd would gasp as amulets, charms, and bits of jewelry emerged. And then the face, a brown, leathery visage, still eerily human after millennia, revealed under flickering candlelight. Some guests gagged. Others applauded. A few even kept scraps of bandage as souvenirs, like concert merchandise from a dead civilization. But here's the twist. These were not small private gatherings. Newspapers in the 1830s and 1840s openly advertised mummy unwrappings. Tickets were sold. Entire halls filled with curious onlookers. Victorians turned death into performance art, and Queen Victoria's reign gave this behavior social approval. Egypt was a crown jewel in the empire, and fascination with its mysteries became a patriotic passion. The upper class could feel both educated and daring while desecrating the past. Reports suggest that at one aristocratic party in the 1850s, guests were even offered wine mixed with mummy powder, the ground-up remains of older mummies sold in apothecaries. Some did it out of superstition, others for the thrill. After all, how many people could say they'd literally tasted history? The more unwrappings that happened, the more normalized it became. Mummy parts were displayed in drawing rooms, sold in curiosity shops, and even used as conversation pieces at dinner. Of course, no one seemed to care that this was cultural theft and human desecration on an industrial scale. To Victorians, these mummies weren't people. They were props in the empire's grand story, proof that Britain could own and consume even the past itself. But mummy unwrapping was just the appetizer. The real horror came next, when Victorians decided that if mummies could entertain, maybe they could also heal. Long before Victorians threw mummy unwrapping parties, Europeans had already found another use for Egypt's ancient dead: medicine. Yes, people ate mummies. Not metaphorically, literally. The bizarre idea began in the Middle Ages, but reached its disturbing peak during the Renaissance and well into the 19th century. Physicians, apothecaries, and even kings believed that consuming bits of preserved human flesh, especially Egyptian mummies, could cure all sorts of ailments: epilepsy, headaches, stomach ulcers, even aging itself. How did they come to such a grotesque conclusion? Well, it all started with a misunderstanding. Traders brought dark, resinous material from Egyptian tombs into Europe, calling it mumia. In ancient Arabic, mumia meant bitumen, a natural tar-like substance used in mummification. European doctors, confused by translation, thought mumia meant the mummy itself. So they started grinding up real human mummies to use as medicine. By the 16th century, the craze was unstoppable. Apothecaries across Europe stocked jars labeled Mumia Vera Egyptiaca, true Egyptian mummy. The finest was said to come from noble or royal corpses, whose preservation was thought to trap vital essence. Even the great minds of history weren't immune to the madness. The philosopher Francis Bacon reportedly used mummy powder in medical experiments. King Charles II of England was said to have consumed the King's Drops, a tincture made from powdered human skull. And while the Victorians liked to think of themselves as enlightened moderns, they inherited this gruesome tradition and gave it a fashionable twist. By the 1800s, mummy powder was still being sold in pharmacies, sometimes advertised as ground mummy flesh or Egyptian balm. Doctors prescribed it for everything from nosebleeds to internal bleeding. Wealthy patients would mix it into wine or sprinkle it into food. It was, in their minds, both exotic and miraculous, the ancient world's secret. Remedy, and here's where Queen Victoria's era made things even weirder. These same people who attended mummy unwrapping parties could then go home and consume the very same stuff. Victorian newspapers and journals described the virtues of mummy-based tonics. Some claimed it boosted vitality, others said it stimulated the blood. In reality, it was just powdered human remains, often mixed with dirt, animal tissue, or resin. But the demand was so high that black markets emerged. When Egypt began running out of genuine mummies, smugglers and con artists started making fake mummies, using recently dead criminals, beggars, or even camels preserved hastily with bitumen and sold to European dealers as the real thing. So not only were people eating the dead, and they might not even know whose flesh they were eating, the Victorians believed they were consuming the wisdom and strength of the ancients. In truth, they were feasting on the ultimate lie, but this cannibalistic craze didn't stay in dusty apothecaries forever. It soon became the fashion of the upper class, who turned corpse consumption into a bizarre form of luxury wellness. Victorian Britain loved to present itself as the shining light of modernity, a land of science, order, and reason. But behind the polished manners and moral sermons was a society absolutely obsessed with death. And nowhere was this obsession more visible than among the aristocracy and even the royal court itself. Queen Victoria's reign, 1837-1901, was marked by both progress and paradox. She ruled over the most powerful empire on earth, yet she also mourned her husband, Prince Albert, so intensely that she wore black for 40 years and surrounded herself with relics of the dead. Hair jewelry, post-mortem photography, mourning clothes, all were fashionable thanks to her influence. So when stories spread that mummies could heal, preserve youth, or even contain mystical energy, it wasn't hard for the idea to find an audience among the upper classes. Let's be clear. There's no documented case of Queen Victoria personally eating mummy flesh. But her court circles absolutely participated in mummy-related spectacles and scientific seances involving Egyptian artifacts. Letters and diaries from her era describe nobles attending mummy unwrapping events as exclusive intellectual soirée. Others claimed they used powdered mummy as a beauty aid, rubbing it into their skin as a supposed anti-aging treatment. One especially lurid rumor came from the late 1800s, when newspapers hinted that mummy dust had been used in royal apothecaries as part of tonics for nervous afflictions. It sounds absurd, but not impossible. Victorians put arsenic in cosmetics, lead in face powder, and cocaine in cough syrup. A little mummy dust didn't seem so strange. Even more bizarre was the belief that mummies contained solar energy. Influenced by pseudoscientific theories about magnetism and vitality, some upper-class Victorians thought that consuming ancient flesh could transfer that life force to the living. The older the body, the stronger the magic. It was, in a twisted way, an attempt to eat immortality itself. There are even whispered tales, passed through memoirs and tabloids, of private dinners where small flakes of mummy were mixed into wine or broth for health and curiosity. Guests treated it like a novelty, a mark of elite daring. Meanwhile, museums and collectors competed for Egypt's dead. Entire mummies were gifted between nobles like fine art. The British Museum displayed unwrapped remains as if they were trophies of empire. And through it all, Queen Victoria's public fascination with mourning and relics kept the culture of death alive, even fashionable. It's hard to imagine today, but to the Victorians, the line between reverence and consumption was blurry. A mummy wasn't a person, it was property. And this royal fascination with the dead didn't just stay in the drawing rooms of London. It spread through trade routes, black markets, and colonies, turning Egypt's sacred tombs into an open grave for profit. Next, we'll travel down the Nile to see how this morbid appetite became an industry, one that stripped Egypt bare and shipped its dead by the ton. By the mid-19th century, Egypt had become more than just the land of the pyramids. It was a giant open-air market for the dead. European demand for mummies skyrocketed. Collectors wanted them for parlors, doctors wanted them for medicine, and showmen wanted them for spectacle. The result? An unregulated trade that stripped Egyptian tombs of thousands of bodies, shipped off like tea, cotton, or spices. The locals even had a name for it: the mummy trade. Egyptian entrepreneurs, tomb raiders, and smugglers, known as sabakan, made a living by looting ancient graves. They'd dig up the mummies, tear away precious wrappings or jewelry, and sell the bodies whole or in parts. Some went to museums, others to private collectors. But the bulk? They were crushed, ground, and exported as mummia, the same dark, resinous powder Victorians swallowed and smeared in the name of health. The trade was so massive that by the 1830s, Egyptian officials tried to crack down. But by then, the damage was done. British merchants were buying mummies by the shipload. One 19th century traveler described piles of mummies stacked in Cairo markets like cordwood. Another reported ships filled with thousands of embalmed bodies, heading for Europe, and not all of them were destined for apothecaries or museums. In one of the most absurd and tragic turns of the mummy craze, some were reportedly used as fuel. Yes, according to multiple travelers' accounts, including that of the American writer Mark Twain, Egyptian mummies were burned in steam engines when coal was scarce. Twain joked that the railways ran on pharaohs. It sounds unbelievable, but Egyptologists like Auguste Mariette confirmed that mummy fragments were indeed sold as fertilizer and fuel throughout the 19th century. The British and French, in their hunger for progress, literally fed the fires of industry with human remains. Even mummified cats, thousands of them, were dug up, packed in crates, and exported. In 1890, one British port received a shipment of 180,000 mummified cats to be ground into fertilizer. Imagine that. Egypt's sacred animals, worshipped for millennia, reduced to crop dust for English fields. And the irony? While Britain looted Egypt's tombs, it also romanticized Egypt's mystery in art, fashion, and architecture. Egyptian motifs appeared on furniture, jewelry, and even gravestones, while the actual dead were being desecrated for entertainment. By the late Victorian era, Egypt was running out of intact mummies. The black market responded by manufacturing fakes, recently dead bodies hastily wrapped and baked to mimic ancient ones. Dealers passed them off as genuine antiquities to gullible Europeans. It was a grotesque loop of greed, ignorance, and colonial arrogance. Britain had turned an ancient civilization into a commodity. Its monuments were trophies, its gods decorations, and its people fuel, medicine, and party favors. But like all dark obsessions, mummy mania would eventually unravel, and not just because the mummies ran out. The 19th century's fascination with the dead took a terrifying turn into superstition and fear. For decades, the British elite had plundered Egypt's tombs without a second thought, slicing open sarcophagi, burning mummies for profit, and snorting their powdered remains. But by the late 19th century, something shifted. The laughter faded. The fascination with Egypt grew darker, tinged with whispers of revenge from the grave. It began with strange accidents. In 1864, a British collector named Thomas Douglas Murray purchased 2 mummies in Luxor. On the voyage home, one of his servants died suddenly. Another fell ill. When the mummies arrived in London, Murray began experiencing a string of tragedies: financial ruin, illness, and the deaths of close friends. The press dubbed it the mummy's curse. Soon, the idea spread like wildfire. Newspapers began connecting every misfortune that struck an Egyptologist, collector, or museum to some mysterious curse. Victorians, those same people who once giggled at unwrapping parties, were now terrified that the spirits of the dead they'd disturbed were exacting revenge. The most famous story of all came later, in 1922 when Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun. Within months, several people linked to the expedition were dead, including Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy British sponsor of the dig. He died of blood poisoning shortly after the tomb was opened, and the press sensationalized it as proof that the curse of the pharaohs was real. But here's the fascinating part. The curse narrative didn't begin with Tutankhamun. It began with the Victorians themselves. The same newspapers that once celebrated mummy parties were now exploiting public guilt. The British knew deep down that they had desecrated the dead. The mummy's curse was, in a sense, a cultural confession, a psychological mirror of empire and exploitation. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, even claimed that supernatural forces guarded ancient tombs. He suggested that unseen elementals were punishing those who disturbed Egypt's sacred resting places. Ghost stories, novels, and stage plays about cursed mummies filled Victorian theaters, blending archaeology with horror. And people believed them. Visitors to museums reported feeling watched by mummies. One famous artifact, the so-called unlucky mummy at the British Museum, gained a reputation for bringing death and disaster wherever it went. In reality, it wasn't even a mummy, just a coffin lid. Still, the fear stuck. By the dawn of the 20th century, mummy mania had mutated, from curiosity to superstition, from science to seance. Victorians who once unwrapped the dead now held seances to apologize to them. The empire that once consumed Egypt's past began to fear it. And yet, even as mummy unwrapping parties faded and public sentiment shifted, the damage was irreversible. Thousands of Egyptian remains had already been destroyed, consumed, or lost forever, all because of a morbid fascination with death disguised as science. But before we close the sarcophagus on this tale, there's one final twist, one that connects ancient tombs, royal rumors, and modern echoes of this strange obsession. You might think that once the Victorians put down their mummy dust and stopped unwrapping corpses at dinner, the madness ended. But it didn't. The legacy of mummy mania and Britain's hunger for Egypt's dead still lingers in subtle, unsettling ways. For one, most of those mummies never made it home. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, tens of thousands of Egyptian human remains were excavated and exported to Europe. Museums like the British Museum, the Louvre, and even small private collections across England, France, and Germany still hold them today. Many lie in storage rooms, nameless and forgotten, their identities erased for the sake of study. Only recently have countries like Egypt begun demanding repatriation, the return of these stolen ancestors. But even now, the process is slow, tangled in legal and political red tape. Each mummy is treated as a scientific specimen, not a person, echoing the exact mindset that created this grotesque trade in the first place. And while we might scoff at the Victorian superstition, our fascination hasn't gone away. Hollywood turned their guilt into gold. The first mummy film appeared in 1932, inspired by the real-life Tutankhamun curse hysteria. Since then, mummies have become horror icons, lumbering symbols of the undead seeking revenge on those who disturbed them. But that's the thing. Every mummy movie, from Boris Karloff to Brendan Fraser, is built on Britain's original sin, the theft and desecration of the dead. It's entertainment born from exploitation. Even medicine isn't entirely innocent. As late as the early 20th century, traces of mummy powder still appeared in some pharmaceutical recipes. And the idea of consuming human material for health, though now condemned, has quietly resurfaced in different forms. Consider modern young blood transfusions or beauty treatments that use placental extracts, new, sanitized echoes of the same old obsession, immortality through the flesh of others. In a strange way, the Victorians' mummy feasts weren't just about death, they were about control. Control over nature, over science, over the past. Eating the dead became a way to conquer them, to literally consume the power of an ancient civilization. And yet, despite their arrogance, the past still haunts them. When you walk through a European museum today and see a mummy lying under glass, you're not just looking at an artifact, you're looking at the afterlife of colonial appetite. You're seeing the ghost of a time when history itself was devoured. So the next time you hear about a mummy's curse, remember, the real curse wasn't magic. It was human greed, and there you have it, the true story behind Queen Victoria's mummy-munching era. A time when empire, ego, and ignorance collided to create one of history's strangest obsessions. The Victorians saw themselves as explorers of knowledge, the bearers of progress. But beneath the polished veneer of science and civility lay something much darker, a morbid fascination with death, power, and the illusion of immortality. They didn't just plunder Egypt's tombs. They devoured its past quite literally, one powdered pharaoh at a time, from royal soirees to grimy apothecaries, from candlelit dinner parties to steam engines running on the bones of kings. This was a civilization drunk on its own dominance. They conquered the land, the people, and even the dead, until superstition and guilt came knocking in the form of the mummy's curse. And maybe that curse was never supernatural at all. Maybe it was the quiet, unending shame of those who built their empire on someone else's grave. So the next time you visit a museum and see a mummy behind glass, look a little closer. You're not just looking at a relic, you're staring into the mirror of human curiosity gone mad. Because history's strangest tales aren't always myths. Sometimes they're just us at our most curious and our most monstrous. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the bizarre, macabre, and utterly nutty corners of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss another dark gem from Nutty Time Tales. Until next time, keep your curiosity alive. But maybe, just maybe, don't feed it.